collective in that you both decided, okay, this is the best way for us to really support each other's work and to get the results and the impact we want to see, as opposed to creating unnecessary tensions, misunderstandings, and then people just kind of feeling like, if there's bad, that you have that bad taste in your mouth, it might change the way that you want to interact with that person, or the frequency with which you might interface, because you feel like you've already created a sense of how this person is going to operate with you. And so I think that's one of the things I would say is most important, is being able to understand that everybody comes from different backgrounds. They have different funding sources, different ways of thinking, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your way of thinking is the right one, or that this organization's way is wrong. Sometimes it's just the way they talk about things might just be a little bit differently, but getting together at the table, you can kind of sometimes find some of those commonalities and be able to focus more on that, and then work towards kind of, again, a more positive relationship with that particular group or ally, and not so much focusing on all of the other things which we know can derail coalition and make work much more difficult if there isn't kind of true cooperation from both sides.
Thanks. When you say derail it, can you explain what you think might derail it?
Yeah, I think sometimes, again, as I mentioned, if there's misunderstanding, if there are people at the table that simply are like, I won't do this unless I get X amount of funding to do this work, it can sometimes feel hard to work with people that that this work is important, but how can you continue to sit across the table from somebody that is not really listening to you in a genuine way, and has already developed kind of a particular perspective or way of seeing things, and if you can't get them out of that, like you keep going back to that table, you'll still continue to feel that kind of that same emotion. And so I think that ultimately can unfortunately make certain partners or staff of some of these organizations feel different about that work. They might not necessarily see it as a priority, or they're sometimes willing to sabotage the work because they really just do not like the personality that might be in that particular coalition. And I've seen that happen where people, don't necessarily see the organizations as individual entities, but just treat the organization as a person who they've had potentially a bad experience with, or a bad conversation. And sometimes that taints the ability for other staff within those organizations to truly connect, because somebody had a bad experience. And it could have been something that happened years ago that you had no connection to, but because that has never been dealt with or really raised, for some people it just stays on their mind, and so they've already kind of established a certain way of how they kind of approach an organization or staff from that organization. So I've seen that in a variety of different kinds of coalitions and campaigns, and so that's something that you need to kind of set ground rules and try to make agreements at the beginning of any kind of collaborative work, in hopes that you can avoid all of these things. And if they do come up, that you at least have a process or a method from which to try to help get you back on track, because at the end of the day that outside issue, whatever, is going to make it harder for you to really stay on time and to get to the goal that you see for your campaign, your particular issue.
Thanks. Can you think of, you talked kind of in general terms about what could derail a coalition. Can you think of a specific project where you might have worked in coalition where it exceeded expectations? You had one set of expectations going in. You said, oh, maybe this will happen, and then it went really well?
Let's see if I can think of one. That's well, probably again, some of the stuff we've been doing with policy. My previous executive director, Marcy Golsing-Gelb, was the person who really helped to push that. And so I was on the fringe on some of these efforts. But I would say one of the areas that we probably were able to see some impact was the floor finishing bill. So we worked with Viet Aid which is another community organization here in Dorchester, to ban floor finishing chemicals from being used by what at the time was primarily Vietnamese immigrants who were doing this, and they were basically, there were two major house fires where workers died as a result of this, using of this particular chemical. And so we collaborated with Viet Aid and some other allies to help figure out, can we actually change the law to ban this chemical? And so I think, we weren't necessarily sure what the capacity of Viet Aid was, or, how we were going to be able to connect a predominantly Vietnamese community with our predominantly, I would say it was white coalition of union members. But I think over time what we were able to see was that there was an understanding that worker safety and health was an issue that everybody had commonality around. And so I think we were able to see a trajectory of that building towards a law, and eventually it was a law that was signed back in 2009. So I think sometimes, you're not necessarily sure, that you're going to be able to do that because you maybe haven't worked with somebody, or you're not necessarily aware of how they operate. But sometimes being at the table, talking regularly, you start to develop those relationships, and then you can kind of think, wow, these people do have the same commitment to social justice that we do. Maybe it's just in a different focus, but ultimately that brings you back to the table and gets you committed to seeing an actual result. And I think ultimately that's what you want to see is commitment. Some of these campaigns that we're on, as I mentioned, the public sector OSHA bill, it's almost a decade to pass. But it's something that we just passed, but we know that we wouldn't have been able to do that on our own. And so I think we always have to kind of figure out, how do you keep engaging people when you have your ups and downs? What can you keep doing to kind of keep that hope alive that this isn't something that we should just give up on and kind of put to the side, but continue figuring out, maybe it's not at the same level of intensity as it was the year before, but it's something that we need to continue kind of working on together. So I think is one of the examples, I would say, probably a little bit better than we expected, because we didn't necessarily know if that was something that they really were going to be committed to as we were.
Thanks. And then on the other hand, can you think of a project where maybe the expectations were not met?
And I don't want to say we're not met, but that we heard feedback that it didn't feel as collaborative as we had hoped. So recently, in the last 3 years, there was the reforming the employer agency law, which is really, it was like a temp worker right to know law that we wanted to pass to be able to ensure that, workers, as they were moving to temp agencies, that they were being given the same kind of information and understanding of their rights, regardless of what language they spoke. And so we were part of a coalition to kind of help push that legislation. But I think what we found is that, and I heard this in the last couple of years, that some people felt that Macintosh was kind of trying to take the lead on this particular work, and that sometimes it felt like the advocacy work or the outcomes weren't being shared among all the other groups. And so sometimes that it created frustration, because I think, sometimes we would put out a media release or put out, like a Facebook post, and then we would get an email or a call about somebody being a little frustrated or concerned. Then ultimately, some of the funding associated with that campaign was also an area where some people felt like, we contributed more work towards it, but we didn't see the same cut of funds, or another organization that did get funds but didn't see them at the coalition meetings or rallies as much as other groups. So that is always an area where I think, depending on, again, that commitment, it can be great when everybody's on the same page, but when you have people that are on different pages or see the campaign differently, you're going to get a varied kind of result. And sometimes some of those tensions and conflict arose as of that. And so I think that was one of the things that I would say was positive about the IWCC, because we had an existing, collaboration there. The idea that is a space where we can try to help hash out some of these issues so that there isn't misunderstandings, or if things weren't done correctly, that moving forward, the next time we ensure that these